introduction to sustainability. And he mentioned already some social and ethical concerns. So I will delve a little bit more into that in my presentation. But I will start first with a story. And seeing that many of you are interested in radioactive waste management, my story is going to be about radioactive waste management. So the story I want to tell is about how the site for the low and intermediate level radioactive waste was decided in Belgium. So what's the story? In the years 90s, there was a geological assessment made as to which sites could potentially be used for the storage of low-level waste. It was purely technical. A list was made of, I think, several municipalities, I think more than 50. And the list somehow leaked, and it was published in the press. So people didn't know about this assessment. You can maybe imagine what happened. There were huge protests, and all the municipalities refused. They didn't want to discuss. So because of this, the Belgian government has recommended that a partnership approach is being used, in which partnerships made by different societal actors from different communities would have the opportunity to discuss about the possibility of having a radioactive waste disposal in their community. And how this was done, communities had to offer themselves as a volunteer to enter a process of discussion, having a veto right at the end. So by entering the discussion, it didn't mean that they have actually accepted, but that they were willing to discuss the conditions in which they might accept it. So 3 municipalities actually offered themselves volunteer. 2 of those were adjacent municipalities, and are those municipalities where low-level waste is currently being stored. So for them, it was the opportunity to go to an even safer option of what was already happening. And then the 3rd municipality that offered volunteer is the one where an institute for production of radioisotopes is taking place. So again, a community which had more affinity, let's say, with the nuclear war. In a process that lasted 20 years, actually 2 municipalities went forward with these discussions, and at the end, it was possible to select one of these municipalities. Actually, both of them were agreeing to host the repository. But there were 3 important elements in this process. First, the fact that they had a veto right. So they participated, but they were not bound to actually accept. The second is, they participated in the design of the repository. It may sound interesting, like how they could actually influence the technical design. Well, they did because, for instance, in the beginning, in the design, there was no inspection space foreseen in the surface repository. The partnerships requested to have one, and now there was a dilemma between safety and this social demand, because from a safety point of view, it was considered that it's better to have no control, no inspection space. So at the end, they reached a compromise that there would be an inspection space, but not for a human, but for a robot. So it would have a lower height. And then they were really able to participate very actively in a lot of decisions taken about the repository. For instance, one important concern was whether, when the repository is constructed, will the cycle pass that existed for many years, will it still be there? You know, Belgium is a country where cycling is a national sport, everyone likes it. So it was like just one minor consideration, but it led to some modifications on how the waste was going to be brought in the municipality. So now the question is, okay, is this a success story? Well, I think it is, because on the one hand, the community participated, a solution was found that was acceptable for experts, but also for communities. And so, could this example be ported to other applications? Why not? Imagine the remediation of a norm site. Why not to have the same process? For instance, to open the discussion on who is going to receive the waste, for instance, resulting from this kind of, from the remediation. So it's good to think outside the box and how we can learn from different experiences. And it's very interesting to see why, for instance, people engaged in this process. And this is a quote from the chair of the municipality that is actually hosting now what will be the repository. And he said, when the call came from the municipality to help think about what to do with the waste, I was relieved. I was allowed to help think and look for solutions, even though I had little knowledge of the nuclear sector. And I'm of the opinion you can be for or against nuclear power, but the waste is there and it has to be safely disposed. So you can see that there was really a lot of interest in participating to how solutions are going to be decided. So with this short story, I wanted to show how social aspects can actually contribute to a better decision making. So this presentation is going to be about social and ethical aspects of environmental remediation and decommissioning. This is a very vast issue, and I will only have 45 minutes, so I will try to pick some elements which I consider important. So when we talk about social and ethical aspects, one thing is to understand their importance, to identify which of these are relevant for a particular situation, to think about how to evaluate them, and how to include them in the analysis. Throughout this course, you will get to touch on all these 4 aspects. For instance, later in the afternoon, you will see how to include social aspects in the analysis. But in this presentation, I want to focus on the first 2 points, to understand the importance and also some guidance on how to identify them. But first, one important element. Any decision you take includes value judgments. Sometimes we say science is objective and then we have to consider values. But actually there are values inscribed in everything we are doing. The models we do, the frameworks we choose, there are always values involved. Horst already talked yesterday about the fact that, for instance, deciding what is a residual dose as low as reasonably achievable. Science cannot tell this because reasonable, this is not something scientific. It requires thinking about what is acceptable in a certain situation and for different stakeholders. So we see already that there is a need to think about which values are more important. You may consider that, for instance, complete elimination of the contamination is what you want to go for, but then you end up with a lot of waste. Or you may think about reasonable as being a balance between environmental, social, and economic aspects. Also, when, for instance, considering those models, like clearly values are inscribed there as well, because, for instance, we don't, the ICRP works with a conceptual human being that is neither a man nor a woman, but sort of takes into account the sensitivities of the different genders. So the value inscribed there being trying to protect the vulnerable from all perspectives. Another example is the understanding of sustainability. There are clear values there, and Giuseppe already pointed on this. So there is no common agreement on how to define sustainability. You can use an anthropocentric view, focusing on the humankind, but you can also use a biocentric view, thinking also about all the living elements in an ecosystem. Non-human biota, for instance. But you can adopt even an ecocentric view, where not only the humans and the living beings are important, but also non-living beings. For instance, a river or a mountain, there are countries in the world where this kind of non-human entities and non-living entities have the same rights as the humans. For instance, rivers or a mountain, for instance, with a symbolic importance, could be considered as a valuable element. So in different countries, different concepts of sustainability may be used. But even if we talk about the anthropocentric perspective, there is also the question, as Giuseppe mentioned, how are we, for instance, considering future generations? Do they have the same rights as us? How, for instance, when you make assessments about the different remediation strategies, you can use a cost-benefit analysis. what is done there? There is something called the social discount rate, which actually means that further generations will have less value. So the models, the tools you use, even in an anthropocentric view, are always value-laden. But then also thinking about sustainability, there are, for instance, the strong and the weak concepts of sustainability. For instance, in the weak concept, we work with this representation of three concentric views. So there is a negotiation between these three elements: environment, economy, society. There is also another representation possible, the strong sustainability. In this case, the representation with three circles, concentric circles. So for instance, you have the planetary boundaries, you have some social minima that have to be respected, and then in between you have the economic system. So all these decisions actually encapsulate some values. And it's important to reflect on them and be aware. Inclusion of social aspects, or lack of inclusion, does influence the effectiveness and also the sustainability of solutions chosen for environmental remediation and decommissioning. I wanted to ask you a question using the Mentimeter, but you have already answered it yesterday. So you already pointed out, and these are selected elements, and all the elements that are, challenges for advancing environmental remediation and decommissioning. For instance, environmental awareness, or lack of expertise, communication with the public, public acceptance, harmonization of rules, lack of regulation. So we see that there are all kinds of elements, and not all are technical. Of course, technology is very important, but there are many more considerations to take into account. And related to these considerations, there are a number of societal challenges. And I say they are challenges, but also opportunities. Because, for instance, thinking about the impact, this is not only related to direct risks from exposure to radioactivity, but also broader socioeconomic well-being. So you say, okay, it's a challenge because we have to take into account more elements, but it's also an opportunity for better decisions. So let's go slowly through these elements. So we know that in terms of impact is clear. We need to think about health and well-being in a more holistic view, but also about socioeconomic development. For instance, imagine the case where you have contamination from an incident or accident. It's not just about reducing doses as low as reasonably achievable, but also how people will continue to live there. There may be, boycott on products, on agricultural products from that area, or people may decide, to not work there anymore, or like it happened, for instance, in Japan. The father in a family continued to work in the affected areas, while the rest of the family moved elsewhere, actually leading to a rupture in the relations between in the family. But also in terms of decommissioning, yesterday I think it was mentioned already, this example. Well, it's very important to think about the socioeconomic development of the community which hosted the nuclear power plant. For instance, in Belgium, these communities receive a financial sort of compensation for the fact that they host nuclear power installations. When they are going to be closed, this is going to disappear. It's going to affect majorly the economic status of the region. But also thinking about the personnel working in a nuclear power plant. Once the decommissioning process has started, they know that basically their jobs will be finished, There is a completely different regime of working, These things have to be considered. Knowledge and awareness. We know that there is sparse knowledge of radioactivity and everything related to it in the population. And this is not only in the general public, but also even health workers or workers in the industry. Healthcare workers or workers in the industry. We had, for instance, in Belgium, a public opinion survey, and we asked what is happening with the high-level waste at this moment. quite a lot of people think it's already being disposed underground. It's quite surprising because we know there is yet no accepted solution. Still, people think that it has already been disposed of. So there are issues that they do not think about in their daily life, and they are complicated. There was a case with a remediation of a site in Germany where they had a stakeholder engagement process, and what they found was that even for people with a, let's say, scientific background, it was difficult in the beginning to comprehend all the scientific reasonings behind making a radiological impact assessment. So it was challenging for them, and we have listened from Horst yesterday just how complex it all is, how there are different levels, different terms, and every word matters because there is a sort of legal aspect related to it. So that's like something that has to be taken into account. Trust between societal actors. This is a very important thing. And we know that in the case of contaminated sites, there may be quite a lot of distrust towards the polluting industry or even towards the authorities. And in that sense, we know from case studies that disclosing environmental information and disclosing information, data about the comprehensive environmental impact assessment is crucial to ensure, to inform the people and ensure also trust building. Perception and acceptability of risks. It's already known in psychology that experts, technical experts, and the public, they see risks in a different way. Experts tend to focus on, for instance, fatalities or cancer probabilities, etc., technical risk estimates, whereas the public is also interested in other aspects. Is it controllable? Is it voluntary? You know, sometimes comparisons are made between smoking and the risks of some other, for instance, I don't know, living in a contaminated, let's say, area. But it's not the same thing, because you choose to smoke because it gives you, let's say, certain benefits, but you maybe did not choose to live in an area which was contaminated from an accident. It's a completely different story. There is also a distinction made between anthropogenic sources and natural sources. If the radionuclides are, let's say, produced through an accident, so they are seen as artificial, the risk perception is going to probably be higher, which is a good thing or not a good thing, because, for instance, in the case of radon, there are big problems that people think, oh, it's a natural gas, everything natural is good, so, you know, we are not so bad. But we know that it's an important lung cancer factor. There is a plurality of values and interests. When you have a stakeholder engagement process, it's not like one public with one opinion. You have different interest groups, and you know, some people are opposed to remediation, some people would like to see remediations going on. So you need to think about how to deal with this, you know, plurality of values and interests. The historical and cultural context, it was already mentioned by Horst before. It is very important. If people had already negative experiences with stakeholder engagement or with how it was dealt with environmental pollution, they are going to be, you know, much more, they will have more concerns. The process is going to need a lot of care. So it's important, you know, when you do the site characterization, which was the first element in the scheme that Horst showed, that you think also about a social characterization to understand, you know, what is the history behind this pollution. Time here is very important. In many cases, or in some cases, it was found, the pollution was found several years after the industry was closed. So suddenly people find themselves in a situation of contamination. They did not personally benefit from the industry because it was already closed maybe before they moved there, but they have to deal with it. Communication, we know, is very important. And sometimes it's difficult to communicate about, you know, all these complex things. For instance, in Belgium, we had a survey, and we wanted to know whether people think about the decommissioning of the nuclear power plants and what do they see as the preferred end state. And we had a big problem, how we are going to communicate decommissioning. Because in Belgium, most people use the word which actually means dismantling. So we're thinking, should we use dismantling? But then it's incorrect. And I mean, everyone understands more or less what it is, but it's incorrect. Or should we use the correct term, which would translate in English to something like declassifying installations? This means something for regulators, but it means nothing for the general public, you know. And we had big discussions, and even among people in our institute which are not involved in decommissioning, you know, they were really surprised about this Dutch word meaning like declassify. What does this mean? So actually what we did was we sort of explained, we said, okay, we use the correct term, decommissioning, but we explained that dismantling is also a part of it. Political support and interest. It's a very important thing. I mean, we all know, and we have heard, I think, from Tiago earlier, there is a problem, you know, remediation takes time, the government changes, nothing works anymore. But also political interest. Of course, if there is a contamination in a big city, maybe politicians are going to be more interested to do something about it than when it's in a remote rural area. So how to raise and maintain this interest is an issue. Legal framework. Nothing is moving, especially in the case of legacy sites, if there is no legal framework which actually clearly states who has to pay what. You know? Even in Belgium, it was only last year, I think, that a law was made concerning the remediation of norm sites. Before that, it was very difficult to move things because the industry was waiting to understand what exactly are their obligations. Stakeholder involvement, I will talk about this later, but we know that it's a key element. It's a key element of sustainability, and it's a key element of effective decision making. Evaluation and decision processes, it's important to understand that there's a connection between the social, economic, and environmental impacts. And when these are not included in the analysis, you risk coming to ineffective decisions. Economic costs, of course, very important, but there's also an aspect of cost distribution, and this is a social issue. Like, who is going to cover the cost? In the case of the site in Germany, that I mentioned earlier, where the contamination was discovered several decades after, the community had to pay 1/3 of the costs of the remediation. They were not happy about it. So it's always good to think how the resources are going to be spent. Then equity and social justice is another important element. When we talk about equity, we sometimes use this picture with a fence. Do you know it? Just to describe what the difference is between equity and equality. I will draw it out for you. So imagine that everyone is given the opportunity to see what's happening behind the fence. So we have a fence, and here is one person, and here is another person. You can say everyone gets the same opportunity, yeah, to look what is behind. But actually, this is not equitable because this person doesn't have access to this information. So what is actually needed? Is that this person gets support in order to be able to, you know, have their voice heard. And equity is important to consider between generations, but also within generations for different population groups. There are several societal constraints. How do you go about it? There was an important project called CIDER, which Horst coordinated, the scientific secretary, giving advice on how to overcome certain societal constraints. I leave it up for you to read it afterwards. Now I would like to concentrate more on aspects relevant to decision making. One point I wanted still to make is that all these dimensions that we saw earlier are interconnected. If you forget about something, you have to think about what the impact will be. For instance, We talked about risk perceptions, concerns, preferences towards remediation options. It has been proven empirically through social studies that these are influenced by how residents perceive their health and their children's health, by the distribution of remediation costs, by equity and justice. So this is not just philosophy. If people perceive the process and the distribution of risk as equitable, it's more likely that the risk perceptions will be lower and they will be more favorable towards remediation options. Also participation. If people participate, you create joint ownership and they are more likely to accept the decisions taken. And then respect of community values. This is something maybe which is not, let's say, obvious, but it is important. Think, for instance, after the accident in Fukushima, the communities affected were very close-knit communities with sometimes several generations living in the same house. Once they were evacuated from the affected area, some of these, let's say, close-knit communities couldn't be housed together. So it happened that, for instance, different generations were scattered around, and this was not, let's say, according to community values. It was, and as a result, it had important effects on the people's mental well-being. Also, it happens that many times, because it takes so long to actually get to some remediation option in some cases, people get this feeling of being trapped in pollution. Nothing is changing, nothing is being decided, but it's moved by itself. Artificial intelligence, maybe it's connected to the timing. Well, actually, if people participate, this reduces their anxiety on top of empowering them for taking decisions. One important problem that we sometimes face is the so-called NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard, There are also several variants to it. Better in your background than mine, or not in anybody's background if something is considered to be really too harmful, or not on planet Earth, or put it in their background. If you don't consider social aspects, you might come to these things. And these are not only for citizens, but also for politicians, like not in my district, not in my term of office, not in my election year, or for industry, not against my business or industry. How can you bypass this kind of NIMBY deadlocks? Interestingly, some advice is given by environmental organizations. So one environmental organization in Belgium that is actually very active and having a good oversight on all the nuclear issues and being very active in commenting, for instance, on environmental impact assessments related to nuclear installations. So these are the advice they give. So for contractors and promoters, they say, be honest and provide accurate information. So not just a pink picture with the benefits, but really provide balanced information. Also be aware that there is the official position and the unofficial position. So they say, take care because your collaborators and staff, they speak for you. So you have to also work internally. And for authorities, they say, be there, because sometimes authorities are seen as a sort of a very distant figure. People don't know very well what it is that they are doing. So be there, have contacts with stakeholders, be neutral if it's possible, and dust off the consultation tools. This means, okay, in general, there are surveys done, or sometimes focus groups, but there is, even more that can be achieved. You can have really a process where people can interact and they can discuss with each other, with experts and with decision makers. And they also had advice for local residents that when they, let's say, formulate an opinion, they should think about the general interest, and then they say, don't forget that you are dealing with people. So it was very interesting for me to see this coming from an environmental organization. They said, at the end, at the heart of every project, there are most of the time well-intentioned people that may be willing to hear what you have to say. So this means there is definitely a willingness from environmental organizations to be involved. So, you should take this opportunity. Finally, inclusion of social and ethical aspects converges with principles of radiological protection, as Horst mentioned, because when he talked about ALARA, he said, yes, but there is this comma, taking into consideration environmental, social, and economic aspects, but also with the ethics of radiological protection. Are you familiar with this document? It's publication 138 from the International Commission for Radiological Protection. And they formulate core ethical values that they say should inform decisions taken. Beneficence and non-maleficence, promoting or doing good and avoiding harm, prudence, so in the face of uncertainty to err on the side of caution, justice, what kind of justice, for instance, distributive justice, so thinking about how risks and benefits are distributed among different population groups, restorative justice, so when you cannot eliminate the risk, you might consider compensating people who have to take this risk, and procedural, so how you take decisions. And also dignity and personal autonomy, so respecting every individual. And what is interesting about these core values is that they were derived by an international group of experts, and they found that these values resonate with different cultures, with different countries, so they could consider them as sort of universal values. What characterizes socially sustainable solutions? Do you have any idea? There is no wrong answer, just shoot. What do you think? Okay, thank you. So Anastasia says balance between social and environmental. Someone else? What could mean, a socially sustainable solution? What are we looking for? Okay, so this is also related, I guess, to balance, yeah? But what does it mean if we are looking at inclusiveness, yes? Anything else? Equality? Or
awareness.
Awareness, so having, do you mean in the sense of also informed decision making? So people can make a decision based on good information? Okay, there is no agreement on what social sustainability means. If you want to be relaxed about it, nobody can tell this is what it is. But it includes many different elements. There is one definition which was provided by McKenzie in 2004, and the important element of this definition is, he says, social sustainability is a life-enhancing condition within communities and the process within communities that can achieve that condition. This means that we have not only to look at the outcome of, for instance, an environmental remediation or decommissioning process, but also at the process itself. Who was involved, how decisions were taken, how the different, conceptual frameworks were chosen. And he also says that it occurs when formal and informal processes support the capacity of current and future generations to create healthy and livable communities. Okay, this may sound quite abstract. How do we get down to earth? If we have a real problem, what do we have to think about? There is a kind of framework which is called the community capitals framework. This is very often used in community development approaches, but it just started to be used now for environmental remediation and decommissioning. So this kind of framework defines 7 capitals which characterize the assets, meaning the resources that a community can use to help its development. And the idea is that if you identify and invest on place-based assets, then the problems that are facing communities can be met and opportunities are created for further development. We can think about an asset as a stock of capital, natural, political, social. And in fact, environmental remediation and decommissioning programs or projects, they can build on existing assets. For instance, using local social networks in order to promote communication about the decommissioning project, but also involve them in how the decommissioning options are being assessed. It can create new assets. For instance, it can create a cleaner environment, or it can create specific infrastructure, but it can also degrade existing assets. So for instance, it can create a lot of waste, pollution. It can lead to less jobs in the region, specifically for decommissioning, let's say, processes. So what do these elements entail? Let's see. Financial capital. This is about incomes, wages, pensions, funds, subsidies, businesses. So when taking a, embarking in a decommissioning or remediation process, you can think about, okay, how will this influence this financial capital, or what opportunities are to actually strengthen the financial capital. The political capital deals with opportunities for citizens to participate and influence decisions. But it's also about the regulation. What regulation is there to protect the environment, ensure social participation. Social capital deals with what's happening at the level of community. Leadership, community groups, collaborations within the community or with other stakeholders, but also things like collective identity, aspirations of community as a whole, or sense of belonging. Human capital relates to things that can be measured, like knowledge, skills, health, safety, leisure opportunity, self-esteem, employment, social security. Cultural capital involves tradition, spirituality, rituals, heritage, language, and worldviews. Natural capital refers to air, soil, water, for instance, quantity, but also quality, landscape, biodiversity, agricultural crops, and also natural beauty. And built capital is about buildings, infrastructure, waste, repositories, roads, etc. So we can think about how the remediation or decommissioning process impact these assets and how we can maybe make use of them. And this is an example. The remediation of a norm site in Belgium, the Winterberg site. This is a place where there was historical contamination. It was not possible to excavate it, but the area was very prone to flooding. So what they did, they made what is called a constructed wetland. So they used nature to actually come to a solution. In this way, the contamination was fixed and less prone to further disperse in the environment. But they also used social capital, collaborations with different organizations within the community and also with stakeholders outside. This is an example of how the assets can be used to strengthen other capitals. For instance, in Netherlands, they have built a temporary storage. Do you know about it? It was built by Cobra, and it's called like the art of preservation. So not only this is a temporary storage for waste, but it is also used to store artistic artifacts. So different objects coming from the Zeeland museums are held there. Why? Because it's a controlled environment, temperature and humidity-wise, so it's very good, to preserve, for instance, tapestries and paintings. But on top of this, they have actually used art to make it more available to people, so to increase their knowledge. So for instance, the painting of the installation is actually becoming lighter and lighter as the time passes. So this is a way to use art first to represent a physical process of decay, but also a way to enhance the cultural capital. You can imagine that people going, you can sometimes visit, you feel more at ease with such an installation in your municipality when it's so well integrated in other resources. How am I understand? Yeah, okay, I had still some slides about stakeholder involvement because we said it's a key element of sustainable environmental remediation and decommissioning. Why? Well, even the ethical principles of radiological protection state that there are some procedural values that should guide the implementation of radiation protection measures: accountability, transparency, and inclusiveness. So you can say that, in fact, it is a norm, not in the sense of naturally occurring radioactive material, but it's a social norm that has to inform decision processes. And there are some legal instruments also that enforce public participation in decisions concerning the environment. For instance, the Aarhus Convention. This is an international convention that I think 46 states and the EU as such have signed, which actually guarantees people the right to participate in decisions that affect them. So this is a sort of like normative justification. But actually there is also value in stakeholder involvement. And again, the ICRP publication 101B says that involvement of stakeholders is a proven means to achieve incorporation of values in decision making, to improve the substantive quality of decisions, and to build a shared understanding with workers and the public. So not only it is being required or recommended as a philosophy, but also it is a proven means to achieve better decisions. And participatory governance, we know, it's a key element of sustainable development. I think everyone has heard about stakeholders. Not everyone understands it in the same way. In general, what we refer to stakeholders is individuals or groups, institutional and non-institutional, who have an interest in the decision. And this interest can be tangible, expressed now, or intangible. For instance, we don't know what the future generations will want. The only thing we can do is to keep the options open for them and explain how we take certain decisions. So these stakeholders can be affecting decisions, affecting the formulation and the resolution of a problem, or representing an affected party, for instance, humans or the environment. There is a pragmatic way to map stakeholders using what is called the quintuple helix of Karayanis. So this describes different categories of stakeholders. So we have the industry, academia, government, the civil society, and the environment. It's important to understand that there are relationships between and within the groups, and also that these groups are not homogeneous. We talk sometimes about the public, but who is the public? You know, there are people, for instance, living in a community next to nuclear installations. There are people living farther away, the general public. There are the workers, for instance, involved in an industry. So we need to think that, okay, there are different subgroups in all these quintuple helix, but this is quite, let's say, encompassing of what kind of stakeholders we may think about. How to identify them? Well, to identify them, you may answer questions such as who are the people interested in the project and its outcome, who or what will be affected by the project, who is involved in the implementation of decisions, who can promote or obstruct the project. Are there any new stakeholders that are likely to emerge? For instance, if we talk about circularity and the valorization of waste, we are thinking of potentially new businesses that might, use these products that result from the process of valorization. When we talk about stakeholder participation, we have to think about the distribution of power. Participation means a redistribution of power in the society. And the IAEA has this kind of, very good, I think, graphical scheme to represent different categories of stakeholders depending on the interest and the power that they have to influence decisions. And for instance, you see that there are people who have a high stake, but with a low power. So they need to be helped, they need help to participate. There are also people with high influence and high stake, and they say, okay, this should be top priority when thinking about stakeholders. So when you will do the exercise, you can try to make this kind of, think about who all the stakeholders are and what kind of, how could they, participate in the decision process. But stakeholder participation is also context dependent. And the context can be situation. It's maybe one thing if you have a legacy site from a historical pollution where the polluter doesn't even exist anymore. It's another thing if you talk about decommissioning. It's another thing if you talk about, for instance, remediation after a nuclear accident. As an example, in the case of Belgium, in the remediation of a historical norm pollution from the phosphogypsum industry, this was carried out by the industry which was the polluter. So it was perceived as a justified rectification of a past situation. There was a limited health impact, and many people have actually worked for the industry, so they have better knowledge. So actually the participation went on quite smoothly. And they had also more trust in the industry. But you can imagine that this is a completely different story if you talk about remediation after a nuclear accident. There is higher potential health impact. There is more distrust and more perceived injustice because it's not always the people next to the nuclear power plant that benefit the most. And it also depends on the cultural and social context. You cannot say this is the method that should be applied in all countries because it will work. That's not the case. And as an example, remediation of a mining site in Australia, they involved Aboriginal groups and regulators, and of course, bringing them, for instance, all together at a table, as you see sometimes when you see pictures about stakeholder engagement, you see people at a table discussing. It didn't work, so there they saw that actually having face-to-face discussions in an informal setting was much more helpful, and in an open-air venue. So this is what it means, adaptation to the cultural context. There are different levels of engagement, from communication to partnerships. It depends what is the objective of stakeholder involvement and what kind of power will they have to influence decisions. You cannot say that one is better than the other because, for instance, you cannot be a partner if you have no communication. You need to understand what the decision is about. So all these steps may be important, but in general, more active forms of participation tend to bring, higher added value. Now, even if you talk about informing or educating, and I'm coming here to a question that was raised yesterday, well, people can still participate. And there's an interesting example from the Navajo Church Rock mining district in the USA, where Navajo people and community advisors participated to the drafting of risk maps, which were meant to show where there are issues with the soil and the water. So not only they participated and they reviewed the graphic design, but also they advised on where should these maps, this information be placed. Another example of more active involvement is the cleanup of the Fernal site in the USA. So this was a site which was related to uranium processing facility, and here they had really a lot of involvement. And community groups were actively involved, and participatory methods were used, like, for instance, charrette. You see people divided in groups and working together to decide what are the important issues to consider, what are the possible options, and then sort of collectively deciding which ones should take priority. And it's very interesting. It was a very extensive stakeholder process, and actually, it led to a very balanced cleanup strategy where they decided that most of the radioactive waste, except for the, let's say, most contaminated part, will be stored on site. So they actually have agreed to something that would have a lesser environmental impact. But on top of this, they created a visitor center. The area, it's now a natural preserve. There's hiking, walking, activities, so they really have constructed a sort of holistic solution to it. Some key principles: stakeholders should be involved as early as possible. It's not always possible to have them very early, but the earlier it is, the better, and also through the life cycle of the project. So right when you start discussing about what is the objective and up to decisions about the final solutions. Sometimes you see a lot of stakeholder engagement processes reported, but it's not clear at all how they actually contributed to the final decision. So we have to keep in mind that this should be transparent, and there should be also described. I mean, many times stakeholder involvement processes fail because it's not clear what the impact will be of citizens' participation. There should be opportunities for stakeholders, including citizens and citizens groups, to express their views, and it is good if this kind of if this is made a requirement also in the regulation, so that there are funds and provisions made to prescribe that stakeholder engagement should take place. So you have to be clear about the influence on actual decisions, and it was seen from case studies that a culture of honesty and transparency with regular information in the long term is the way to go. Transparency in all stages of the project, and also adapt the involvement process to the context. What is the added value for environmental remediation and decommissioning? Well, you can include perspectives that would otherwise not be taken into account. You can address social, cultural, technical issues appropriately. You provide also first-hand information, because through the involvement process, citizens get information from the experts, so you know they will get the best and most accurate information. You can build relationships between stakeholders and with the authorities. You can avoid potential conflicts and costly litigations. You can reach solutions that are accepted by communities and also stimulate social learning. It's not only people that have to learn from experts, but also the other way around, because experts, they are very good in what they are doing, but they cannot have a broad overview on everything that plays in a community. So to end with this, what are the takeaways? Whenever you are doing some decisions, there are inherent values that are there, so you have to be aware of what they are. The inclusion of social and ethical aspects is justified, and it's also contributing to better decisions. I mentioned the asset-based approaches that might provide some good, let's say, points to follow when thinking about the impact on a community, and that stakeholder involvement is key. And we see many times in the nuclear world that it's a reactive rather than proactive attitude. So things are happening, and if there is no opposition, we go along without consulting anybody. Well, this is an option, but if you have done it and at the end you reach a position, it may be more costly to go back. The trust is not there anymore. So in the long term, it may be better to be proactive, study the need for stakeholder engagement, discuss with people about how the process could take place, and reach decisions. Thank you very much. This is the end.
Just wait a bit, some seconds. Okay, you can see that the presentation Catherine just made followed very nicely the one that Giuseppe introduced, and she went pretty much on these ethical, social values and their importance. As a technical person, so to speak, when I started my work in the agency, I was thinking that pretty much I would deal only with technical issues. Technologies provide solutions and these kind of things, but then I realized very fast that only this would not do the job. So we need to pay attention to the kind of things that Catherine just raised, and this is why we strengthen this partnership. Questions from you? Anything? Yes.
Thank you, Catherine. Oh, sorry. Well, you talk about this survey in Belgium, and I would like to know who was the responsible to promote that. It was the government, the operator?
No, it's our institute. We have an institutional survey. So in our institute, we have a social science small group, big, like 4 researchers in a 700 research, or more than 700, let's say, staff. And we do regular surveys, like more or less every 2 years. And we include there some longitudinal items like perception of nuclear risk, but also some items which are of interest to us at a specific moment. And given that, well, at least in Belgium, there is a phase-out law, so theoretically all nuclear power plants will need to be decommissioned in no later than 10 years, we started to put some interest in decommissioning. So we are not doing the field work, but we are commissioning the field work to a market research company. So they are doing, well, before COVID, we did computer-assisted personal interviewing, where you go to the house of the respondent and you ask all the questions. After COVID, no one is doing this anymore because it's too expensive, and during COVID it was not possible. So now we sometimes use it's called internet panels. So public opinion research companies like Ipsos or TNO, etc., they have internet panels, so they select respondents. But we are always looking for a representative sample of the population, or in some cases we look at specific target populations. So for instance, for the decommissioning, in 1 year we selected from people living close to the 2 nuclear power plant sites in Belgium. So 150 people in one site, 150 people in the other side.
Okay, and another question is, how was the beginning of this process with the community? They took this well, or they know about something, or was difficult?
Well, so I mean, we did several things. Well, we did this survey. In these surveys, we don't interact directly with community members, but we also had a workshop which was organized at the Recomet conference. This is an international conference bringing together social scientists and also technical experts to discuss about ionizing radiation research. So I think it was last year that members of local communities from Belgium, Netherlands were being brought together just to discuss. The topic was how to communicate about decommissioning, so they were able to express their views about this, and they are very eager to discuss about this, I have to say. In Europe, there is also something which is called the Group of Municipalities of Nuclear Facilities. So this is a network, I think it's basically mayors of municipalities with nuclear installations are very active together. They provide advice on nuclear issues, even for the European community, and they have, when they discuss different topics which are of interest, like decommissioning, new nuclear installations, SMRs, etc. So usually it's also through these networks that it's easier to interact with local communities.
Can I make just a technical note here? It turns out we have a defect in design of this audiovisual system. So if you're under these things and you do this, it's supposed to, that awful noise is supposed to happen. So keep the microphone like this, right? And so just keep it like this, never do it like this.
So this is a very good example of perfect technical solutions, right, and how they can fail in practice. Yes. In the real world.
Thank you, Katrina, for the presentation and experience shared.
And you have to wait 7 seconds.
Again, thank you for the presentation and experiences shared. Indeed, stakeholder involvement is very important, and shall the organizations consider it as an investment, they will do so, and they will not hesitate to understand what are the latent and also expressed needs of their stakeholders. However, it's not always that stakeholders are interested to interact and to just share their concerns, even their experience. So there should be some innovative methods, and not only the conventional focus group meetings. So like Alan stated yesterday about serious games, gamification, etc., etc. I believe in some cases we can apply such solutions and to just extract, to obtain the experience of the local society and the stakeholders as a whole. And we believe that some slight effort in the beginning of any project will save lots of fortune, lots of effort in upcoming stages, and not only in nuclear power, but also in other projects, even like road building, construction, etc., etc. It saves lots of time and effort. Thank you again, and good luck.
Thank you very much for your comment. You are right, and now we see that this kind of, I don't know if they are innovative they are innovative as such sometimes, or they are new for the nuclear field, because somehow nuclear field is sort of trailing behind, even when you talk about chemical and radiological pollution. For instance, you will see later on that in the chemical field they have already made a standards for sustainable environmental remediation. Is starting to be used more and more, but as for the radiological, we are still discussing what sustainable environmental remediation is, although there is an international standard for this now. And about serious games, yes, for instance, for radioactive waste management, I don't know if you know, but there is a game developed, PEP, I think it's called. And this is very interesting because it's not to reach a decision, but it's to make people think about the consequences of, for instance, immediately constructing a geological repository and putting the waste there, or constructing the repository but then waiting still whether society will want to take the solution, or whether you want to wait for a longer time, sort of postpone. And it's very interesting because people have to reflect on how these different solutions are robust to different societal or political challenges. Like, for instance, what do you do if there is, I don't know, economic collapse or geopolitical instability, how you are able to deal, for instance, with this waste when it has not been, disposed of yet, how you are going to ensure institutional controls or, even safety and security. So it's starting, yes, and now, there is this paradigm of transdisciplinarity, and there are a lot of tools which are being developed, also work cafes and value processed thinking, value-based thinking, etc. Or design thinking, which I was mentioning yesterday, where you actually use citizens to design, for instance, a communication tool or some other issue that you want to address together with them. So you are using this collective intelligence from people. This has been done, for instance, for radon in a European project. They wanted to see how to communicate about radon, because even if people know that it's dangerous, they still are not taking measures to test or remediate their houses. So they wanted to see, okay, how to do it. And they identified with citizens what are the problems. And also they tested different ways to communicate, like should you use this kind of scary message to say, you will get cancer, you have to do something, or should they use a bit more humor, or like to say, oh, you look, radon is there, but I put my head in the sand like an ostrich and I'm good, And it's very interesting, they actually discovered that using this humor-based communication is more effective in, motivating people to, do something about it. So yeah, there is great potential in these new methods.
Yeah, it's just quick, maybe, we think a lot about, in our center, about participatory processes. But the biggest challenge in a context where you don't have, you have a big economic disparity in society. The poor people are the ones who have to be heard, and they're the least able to participate because they're holding for 3-4 different jobs and they have to run from one job to another to make ends meet. So in the context where there is this income disparity, what would be your recommendations how to approach people who are not able to afford to participate in these processes?
Yeah, I mean, one important thing is to secure funding, You need to, if you have no funding available, there is not so much
you mean to pay people to participate, or?
Not to pay them to participate, because you can get the opposite effect, but at least to support, for instance, their transport and accommodation. Like, for instance, in Denmark, they use consensus conferences. The people are there for a weekend, so you need to pay, the cost. So it costs. You need to hire a facilitator. So, I mean, there are costs involved. If you have no funds allocated, there is not much you can do. And then, of course, also thinking about where it will take place. You can go close to the community that is of main interest. You can think when to do it. So, for instance, if you do it like Tuesday morning, who is going to be there? Only those people whose institutions allow them to participate, but other people are going to have to take holiday. You can do it in the weekends. If you want to help mothers participate, you organize a daycare, so that you try to understand what would make it easiest for them to have a voice.
So, well, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I would just to share my experience on public hearing. I have two experience. So, in 2011, worked in that time in Ministry of Energy, was head of Atomic Energy Department. So we organized public hearing for a new nuclear power plant in the region which should be we wish to construct new nuclear power plant. So during the public hearing, one lady said that nuclear is dangerous, we don't want nuclear, etc., etc., just only one lady. So we suggest her to, she was teacher in the school, we suggest her to provide tour to the nuclear power plant, existing one, for the teachers. After that, the group of teachers signed an agreement and providing tour for high school children, and everything was okay. The second one, it was organized in Gyumri for the same purpose in Gyumri region. It's a north part of Armenia, and there was everything okay. So you by me for with stakeholder, you have to first of all try to establish the dialogue, and during the dialogue explain your position and try to understand their positions and come to agreement. So thank you once again.
Thank you for sharing. Of course, the dialogue is a must. As we were seeing before, science cannot provide us all the answers, so then the only solution is to have a deliberative decision making. Of course, we also have to think about when we communicate, for instance, about nuclear energy, we also have to keep in mind to provide balanced information, and sometimes, this is my personal experience, sometimes I see, for instance, when nuclear energy is communicated, it's written there also that it's useful for medical purposes. I mean, nuclear technology is useful for medical purposes, but you don't need to have nuclear energy for that. So, I mean, you have to think also about being, I see Horst frowning, he doesn't agree with me, or you agree, or you disagree, you can say. But so anyway, it's good to keep in mind to provide as accurate, honest information and to respond to what people want to know. Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences and for your questions. If you have further questions, please just come to me.
So, as I said again, these presentations are very much interconnected. It's not by chance. We work together with preparation so that the flow could lead you to this chain of thinking, so that we can step by step build our house, right? And I just want to make one thing pretty clear, and by my own experience, in the beginning of the nuclear era, nuclear was essentially associated, and rightly associated, to weapons, to wars, to destruction. And that was a very bad kind of a legacy that nuclear had. Even in my country, when we have the meetings of the Brazilian Society for Science, there was a heavy criticism of nuclear because it was mainly dealt with by the military. And that was there was a dictatorship in the country at the time, so the scientific community found a way through the nuclear to criticize the government as well, because of lack of transparency, lack of communication, secrecy. So this legacy was brought to the times today, and even to break this idea in the minds of the new generation is very difficult, because the organizational culture is already still there. And there are situations there is no secrecy at all. And we should disclose, because the worst thing for a community is to know that something is being taught about on their back without their knowing what's going on. And all of a sudden, they realize that it was going on without their knowledge. And sooner or later, these things will come to light. So still, these things persist. About nuclear, my position is very clear. I'm not pro, neither against, ideologically speaking. I think that it's on the table. It should be appreciated, but without any preconceived ideological thinking. I know that some people are against nuclear as a default position. I think this is not very wise, because in many cases that will be the best solution. And when that will be the best solution, it has to be adopted, because we can do it in a safe way. It can be done in a safe, even considering the waste management aspect, there are solutions for waste management of nuclear, but it has to be done in a proper way. And we need to be very clear about all those things. So this thank you, Katrina. This was one of the things I wanted to mention. But now I want to speak about sustainability and circularity in the context of remediation, also in the context more of the mining processing industry. Giuseppe raised a lot of important issues, and we need to really digest all those things that he talked about. Catrinel talked about the social dimensions and ethical considerations and how to get people involved. And what I want to do here modestly is to show what we can contribute to this conversation, what we can, in the technical terms, bring to the table as a way to deal with the issues that were raised. And I'll try to do this in a very quick way. So, we see that we are very much on the same page when our slides repeat each other, because we are making the same argument. And we start by the projections of population growth, which is something which we have to concern. And we see here that the distribution of population around the world is not even, is not homogeneous. So there are some areas with more people, areas with less people, but also the living conditions are not really the same. And we need to take this into considerations when we make our analysis. Again, Giuseppe mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. I just want to mention about electrification, because this is associated with improvement of living conditions. The question is, which sources are we going to use? Responsible consumption and production. This is another point that Giuseppe mentioned. To what extent our lifestyle is sustainable in the sense of the way we consume things. For example, he mentioned the big computers in the 60s and the tablets and smartphone that we have now. The point is that the industry is pushing us to buy a new one, a new model, that not necessarily add that much value to the one we had before, but this impulse of consuming the new version lead us to have the new one, and what we do with the old one, we throw it we dispose it as waste. So this is something that we consider. And dematerialization of the society, as Giuseppe mentioned, is that essentially we do not need to own what we use, because if the owner is those that produce, they need to take care of what is left over when you're not using anymore. So we are leasing things, not being the owner of. So it's a changing concept that might be a response to the challenges that we are facing right now. So, and that's why I push Giuseppe in the creative destruction. We need to break up some paradigms so that we can accommodate our living standards in a reasonable way, but with changes in our own behavior. For example, our reliance on natural resources is increasing and rising 65% globally from 2029. So the point is in which way we can sustain that. In terms of climate action, energy-related CO2 emissions increased 6% in 2021, reaching highest levels ever. And life on land, we need to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystem, sustainably manage forests, particularly a big issue in Brazil with the Amazon forest, we are always on the spot because of the burns that are reported, sometimes a bit of exaggeration, but there are facts over there. The desertification, which is also affect us, because where we used to have wetlands, now we have dry lands because of the situation that we are facing now. And we have to reverse land degradation and biodiversity loss. Giuseppe also mentioned the big issues about Amazon forest is not the idea that Amazon forest is the lung of the world. We know that most oxygen comes from the ocean, but the problem of Amazon forest is its biodiversity, which is one of the highest in the world. And when you burn areas that are relevant, you are losing biodiversity, essentially to grow grass to produce cattle. So these are the things we need to do, we need to think about, very concrete things, just not philosophical, but very practical, and we need to provide answers to all this. So, in summary, this is the context that I have mentioned to you. I will not go more into details on these ones, but summarizing here, we have this growth in fossil fuels, 73% in biomass, 97% in non-metallic minerals, and 126% in metals growth to 2060. Well, this is something from 2017 levels. So these are the projections if we keep going the way we are going right now. So we talked about the linear economy. This is what we are so far used to do. We have the raw materials, we have the production, we have the use, and then we dispose things as waste. This is what we have been doing so far. Then we have the reuse economy, where still non-recyclable wastes are produced, and the circular economy, where you have a closed loop, where no waste is generated. Okay, you will say, it's not possible, this is utopic. Yes, it is, but I remember, because the Rio Convention, Rio Summit, the Global Summit in 1992 took place in Rio de Janeiro. I remember I participated in that. I was very young, by the way, but I remember that. And when we talk about sustainability at that time, many people would say, oh, forget about it. Sustainability is not achievable. How can mining be sustainable? And you cannot do anything today if you're not involving sustainability concept in your thought. So when people tell me, oh, but this is utopic, you cannot have a closed loop. I said, not yet for many things, but we can make steps in that direction and have this at least as a kind of a vision in way we do our business. So this is my particular message when we talk about circularity. Important here to distinguish between circular economy from the other ways of production is that we don't see the waste as the end point. Also, you have heard of people who work with waste management hierarchy, right? Where you avoid, you reuse, you recycle, and the last resource is disposal. The difference between waste management hierarchy and circular economy is that in the waste management hierarchy, Still, the waste is the end point. And in the circular economy, we try to avoid that waste is generated. So we maximize the use of materials in a closed loop. That is the idea. So the circular economy, a key driver for sustainable development, is not the same. Circular economy does not mean the same as sustainability, but it contributes to. And some data that we can share with you: 100 billion tons of materials enter the global economy every year, resulting in 39 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Only 7.2% of the world resources are reused or recycled. So we have a lot of room to improve. And adopting the circular economy maximizes resources. And from the economic point of view, data from the UNESCO, United Nations agency in Europe, circular economy could, in principle, unlock something like $4.5 trillion by 2030. So it means that even from the economical point of view, there is justification to adopt a circular economy way of production, if we are talking about only in terms of economy. This is more complicated, but what I want to emphasize here is that the idea is to use waste as a resource instead of disposing the waste without any beneficial use. And when we think what is needed to create a circular economy, it's important to have skills for circular products. Design, the circular economy should be already placed in the design phase of a given product. We need as well new business models. We cannot sustain the circular economy in the prevailing business model that we have today. And the enabling circular systems will include education, financing, collaborative platforms, and new economic framework. I could go into details on that, but to give some examples, if there is any sort of incentive for procurement, let's say by the government, to procure materials that are recycled, that's an incentive for recycling more. Just one aspect. Giuseppe mentioned about taxations. Taxation is something that nobody likes. Nobody wants to give money away. But eventually the boundary conditions of our economy will need to change. And instead of taxation, we can talk about incentives that might end up being related to some sort of, because the point is, it's a best balance. There is no way that you will create money in a society. It has to come from a place. If you take out from here, you need and give there, so you need to balance all these things. But you can do it in a wise way, my point of view. So important considerations on circular economy. As I mentioned, circular economy is not the same as waste management hierarchy, because in the waste management hierarchy, waste is still the final endpoint. Circular economy envisages a zero waste approach. Interim storage. Some people will advocate that, wait a minute, we don't know what to do with the material right now, but let us not dispose the material yet. Let us keep it, because eventually there will be an opportunity to have good use for that. Pros and cons. The pros is essentially what I mentioned. But the cons is that some people may see that this is a procrastination to find a solution. A good example of this is spent fuel. Spent fuel. Spent fuel will be termed as waste by a decision that you don't want to add any value to the spent fuel. But we know that spent fuel has aggregated value and a lot of energy. So there is a decision to be made whether you take this value or you dispose as waste. So instead of making a disposal, what is disposal about? Disposal is to place something without the intention to retrieve. Storage, on the other hand, you have the possibility to retrieve the material. And as Catherine said, words matter. So when we say storage, we are implying something. When we are saying disposal, we are mentioning about some other thing. So in this case, talking about storage, because there is a potential interest to retrieve. But that cannot be taken as a way to push forward the problem to the future. Of course, oh my God, innovation is needed to make feasible the recovery of valuable resources, because the consumption is market dependent. It will be very difficult to justify buying something that is more expensive than something that is produced with natural resources, raw material. But the point is, again, that depends on how you implement your economic analysis, right? So there is a link about all those three things that we are talking about. You see that the economic analysis is here. I was in the US last year, and when I was talking about recycling and all these things, there was a lady that said to me, there will be no way that my industry will go for recycling while recycled materials are more expensive than those that I can get from natural sources. How do you react to that? I said, well, that depends on how the economy boundaries are established, because if you make the raw material more expensive, then the economy balance changes. Many people will call subsidies, as I've just mentioned now, but some people will say, oh, but this is taxpayer money. So I'm not very much fond of this solution. Legislations need to be developed for a linear economy. Legislation that were developed for a linear economy, they have to be adapted for a circular economy. And that hit us very much, as I will mention right away. There is a need to reconsider the way our legislation is developed. An example, you heard about the 3 principles of radiation protection. And the first one was, if you remember, justification. And the justification says that something we are doing needs to provide more good than harm. That in terms of the detrimental effects of radiation. But if you put in the equation the reduction on the pressure of natural resources, in that equation, you may think, well, I may be exposing myself to a bit more radiation, an increased level of radiation, that will not eventually add the risk of any health effects, because it's a very marginal increase. But on the other hand, I'll be reducing the pressure on natural resources that will have a much higher benefit to the society than a very tiny amount of radiation in a product that will be made available without compromising the safety of the people. So that conversation needs to be put in place. You agree with me? So this is it. But that can only be done if we have a consensus between the different member states that are represented, for example, in the IAEA, when the standards are being developed. Because without this consensus, these things will not be changed. So there is a lot of need for raising awareness and for debating and spreading these ideas. And this leads us to the stakeholder perception. Do I want something containing radioactivity? Granite that Brazil exports to the United States used to face a very strong technical barrier that in the end of the day hides a commercial barrier, because granite contains uranium, and some people will say that the granite that you use in the cupboard of your kitchen will definitely enhance your exposures to radon that will exhalate from the cupboards of your kitchen. Well, in principle, that would be true. But the point that the final result of this increase is marginal. So this is a typical case where a technical argument is using to hide a very important commercial barrier. And that will lead the people to say, oh no, I don't want this because my exposure to radiation will increase. And that is very complicated. And the importance of this slide here is that the framework that we need to deal with material, with the economic, with the social, with the energy, has to involve all these actors here in different levels. It's not possible to move away without political and legislative interference. You need to involve the industry in this discussion, the consumers, non-profit sectors, have economical and technical analysis. All these things needs to come together to find these solutions that we all need. So, 3 musts for recyclable to become recycled. Recyclable to become recycled. A waste material can only go from being recyclable to really being recycled when 3 conditions are met. First of all, it has to be a cost-effective recycling technology process for it to start up with. So, in the equation that Giuseppe mentioned, there is this T for technology. Technology has an important role to play. There should be a potential market for recyclate, which the technology process produces. So there should be a market for that. It's like biofood. Biofood without pesticides, without chemicals, many people will value that. But the point that you need to make it get to the producer, to the consumer, quite fast, because it deteriorates very, very rapidly. For example, if you buy bio bananas in the supermarket, you get it home, in a couple of days it starts to be rotten, because between the moment which is taken until the moment that it takes them to your house, there is some time that could be really faced if this were, for example, sterilized with ionizing radiation. But if it is not, then you have a problem. And the losses can be very important. And when you think about production in scale, like for example, again in Brazil, we have a lot of very strong agricultural activity, and these things are exported to China, to the European market. So you need to take into account all these supply chain, all the logistics that are part of that thing. So I appreciate the idea to consume things without any kind of preservatives, but we need to balance how these things will take place. This is my understanding. And definitely the price of the recyclate should be lower than the equivalent virgin material. And this is where you might have interference of the government, this cowboy economy without rules, without borders. That kind of thing has to be given a second thought. So these are the list of the critical materials, and you see that this list has been increasing from 2011 to 2017. And what caught my attention here is that uranium is not part of the list. And I was just thinking, why not? Because the truth is that uranium coming from high-grade ore deposits is decreasing. That's a fact. And as the projections talk about, nuclear energy will have a role to play in the decarbonization of the economy. So if that is the situation, we will need to look for sources of uranium that are not high-grade ore deposits. So this is why, for example, in Kazakhstan, in situ leaching is being used quite intensively. You know what in situ leaching is? you inject alkaline or acid solutions underground, you pump it off with uranium in the solution, and then you strip off uranium. Okay, people will say, well, but this is a very horrible environmental impact. If it is well done, well designed, well projected, and well executed, that will not be the case. But in the mind of the people, how would you react that you are injecting acid in the ground to take uranium out? And the other point is that, yes, you can operate low-grade ore deposits. And this is essentially the Poço de Caldas project. It was a low-grade, and low-grade you need a lot of material to give an amount of the final product. And when you do that, the consequence is that you generate a lot of waste. So I was kind of surprised that uranium is not there in the list. But there are important things that are relevant to us. Phosphate rock, for example, magnesium. And interesting thing is that solutions are coming. For example, desalination. You are familiar with desalination, right? You take seawater, through reverse osmosis and membranes, there are different technologies. You separate clean water, desalinated water, and you have the brine. And the brine was always a problem to be managed. But what technology brings us? The possibility to do brine mining. What does it mean? To take magnesium, to take rare earth from the brines. So you mine the waste that is generated with desalination. So you see how technology comes in. This whole conversation, whatever was a waste in the past, now is a source of valuable material. And we will see some examples in here. So the 5 big bets for the circular economy so far has been food system. The amount of food that we waste is quite amazing. Sometimes we waste more than we consume. Packing. Who buys things over Amazon? Well, how does it come? In a package, right? In a box of paper. So it's very convenient, it's very nice. You go to the internet, you demand 2 days, 3 days, it's at your home, but in a package made of paper. So you can imagine the amount of paper that is generated with that. So this is something that has to be recycled. The built environment, it's amazing. I have some information from the European Demolition Association, and the amount of materials that can be recycled from construction is quite a lot, instead of being deposited in landfill. There are some conditions for that, but it's a very strong candidate. Electronics, of course. Imagine the amounts of metals you have in batteries, you have in all these kind of things. So this is again the idea of mining instead of deposit those things in waste, industrial waste, industrial landfills. Fashion and textile in the desert of Atacama in Chile. There is the photography is amazing. How much? Because we want to buy cheap clothes, but we only use it once or twice, and then we discard it out as waste. And I just wondering myself, why do that? I can use this for long periods of time, just to be on fashion. This is the fashion dictating consumption, but I don't need to be a slave of fashion, right? You can have more durable clothes instead of producing this amount of things that will just be discarded after being used for a couple of times. But what is not very clear is the possibility of non-mining related industries. It's not yet there. So I will talk about it in a while. And as enablers for all these kind of things that connect with what Giuseppe mentioned, we need harmonized and supported policies. We need business development support. We need data availability, inventory. We need technology that links to innovation. We need access to financial services and infrastructure. This is an analysis that tries to provide concrete answers at the different levels to the issues that were raised in the beginning of the day. And we need to think about it, and there are a lot of people working on these issues, and I believe that tomorrow we will hear from Alan some of the experiences that are going on in Armenia, right? And we need to be very open-minded, because sometimes the examples will come not from our own business, but will come from business that are correlated to what we do, not exactly what we do, but we can get inspiration. So it will be very nice to hear the experience from Alan tomorrow. In the valorization, I introduced this word here, valorization analysis scheme. Valorization is mean to add value to something there is no value at the moment, right? So it's very important to have a characterization of these materials, physical, chemical properties, mineralogical, mechanical properties, understand the hazards and risks that might be associated with materials that are being valorized, understand the economical efficiency, and then there will be different possible applications like metal recovery, building material, absorbent, catalyst, soil amendment, revegetation, and that will give us different options of application, right? So there is a scheme that can be used to valorize this waste. So now narrowing down to mining residues, which is part of my business. What are the low-hanging fruits? What is easy to discuss? Humankind's earliest and most persistent form of environmental contamination can be seen as mining. We have tailings impoundment facilities that require high capital and operational costs. This is true. When we decided to have the tailings as a fixed deposit for waste, most iron ore tailings could be made into industry-graded sand, so options are there. Potential with phosphogypsum and red mud. This is why I asked Alexandra yesterday, what are you doing with the phosphogypsum? We will see application for phosphogypsum. And the major idea is to make a challenge become an opportunity, or turning a legacy into an asset. This is what I'm trying to teach here. So in IAEA, we developed a tech doc. This is a colleague of mine, Martin Fairclough, where he examined the potential of recovering uranium from different resources. So the amounts of uranium that would be existing in mine waste. So he investigated bauxite residue, tin slags, coal, bottom ash, and fly ash, phosphoric acid waste stream, processed liquids of copper ores, rare earth materials. So there is a lot of uranium out there. Then you say, well, but the economic will not favor the recovery of uranium from these materials here. And again, I would say that depends on how the economic analysis will be made. Because if there are some changes, eventually those things will be relevant. Still talking about uranium mining, for example, I discussed yesterday the possibility that the mine waters, particularly when you have acidification of these waters and high contents of uranium, these materials could be recovery. Uranium could be recovered from the water instead of precipitated and disposed out, as Tiago mentioned yesterday. So we need to look into this possibility as well, in addition to investigate the possibility that tailings can also be reworked and metals be recovered from the tailings. So some conclusions from the tech doc that I mentioned. A metallurgical account indicates that the global mass of uranium mill tailings contain at least between 0.07 to 1.74 metric tons of uranium oxide. Mine waters of active and historical uranium mines may contain uranium concentrations that are of possible economic interest and could be extractable using established technologies. No real rocket science here, no real need for advanced technologies, just using the technologies that already exist. You can extract uranium from these waters. And recovery of uranium from mine waste may ultimately initiate the valorization of uranium resources, support resource use of uranium ores, and help the transformation towards a circular economy in uranium mining. So this is one possibility, practical possibility to contribute to address the issues that Giuseppe mentioned. But we have more examples. For example, red mud bauxite applications. These are the different kind of applications that the red mud is the tailings that remain after aluminum production, right? So it's called the red mud. You see how many applications you can have, like, for example, road constructions, bricks and pavements, cement and concrete, and so on and so forth. So solutions are there. Solutions are there. We need to explore them and make them feasible from the point of view of the economy and from the point of view of social acceptance. Even for coal mine, you might think about a circular model for coal mining, taking into consideration the emissions of CO2, because you can apply the fly ash and the slags from coal mine in different materials that will be used again in further applications. So this is another possibility. And not only about materials, but also about the site. And this is where remediation comes into place. I spoke about circularity taking into consideration the wastes, but now I'm talking about the possibility of applying circularity thinking associated to sustainable options, in the sense that we need to rethink mine remediation from harm reduction, and as the definition that I introduced yesterday of remediation, if you remember, remediation being reducing doses. This is the main message that is behind remediation, but we move beyond reducing the doses, reducing the risks, but we aggregate value to the sites. So, legacy to asset. Instead of having a problem, we have an opportunity, right? So we can do that by different mechanisms. For example, remediation for recreation and commercial purposes, like seasonal sports. For example, Catrinello loves hiking, right? So many areas of mining offers a good possibility for hiking without any major hazard. Fishing and hunting, camping resorts, retreats. Some areas, the mine lake, the pit lake, is absolutely benign waters. And you can use these waters for different purposes. Also, nature observatory parks, especially gardens. The Germans in Wismut, they developed the Buga. They made a beautiful gardens where you have visitation of people there. They have golf courts on the top of the tailings dams, the waste rocks, I mean. So they added value to something that was, in principle, completely degraded environment. And also reclaim self-sustainable ecosystem. I'm missing something here, but I will complement that with some practical examples. We're not talking theoretically about it. It's happening right now. For example, Orano is a French company. They have a policy in which the sites, the mining sites, can be put into beneficial use, and they call the second life of the mines from economic, environmental, and social perspective. In the terms of economic perspective, so some of them are reconverted to industrial facilities, some of them reconverted to agricultural activities, and others reconverted to photovoltaic power plants. I will show you this one. You have a solar farm, for example, and a pit lake. And interestingly, I did not know that if you have a pit lake in high altitudes, you can be as much as efficient in producing energy as if you have the solar farm in a desert. So this is something that you can turn a pit lake of a mine into a solar farm to produce energy. And with the money you do with this, you can definitely pay for the remediation work that needs to be implemented. So these are essentially some ideas that need to be explored. We need to be more creative to pursue solutions like this. But then you need to attach science, you need to attach technology to political decisions, because many of these things have to be addressed at the political level so that you can make the system works in the direction of a new paradigm that is needed to face all these challenges that Giuseppe mentioned. So what I want to say is that solutions exist. We need to be able to invest in the solutions. Does it solve all the problem? No. It doesn't solve all the problem, but it contributes to. And we need to bring those ideas into practice, right? So my conclusions is that the concept of sustainability is present in the international stage for decades. It's there for many years. Giuseppe mentioned that. It's not new. It's gaining momentum, but it's present for quite a long time. And in the IAEA standards, I made a kind of a search. I'm a little bit obsessed with internet. And it's very easy to track those things. I took some documents of the agency and just find the word sustainability. And there was no mention to sustainability in the standards of the agency until a certain point. And then you see that our organizations are very reactive. Our organization, like the agency, react to what the member states ask us to do. We cannot be proactive. We cannot work on behalf of the member states without them telling us what we should be doing. So this has started to be incorporated in the standards of the agency a long time to react to what the society is telling us. But now it's appearing there, not yet the word circularity, not yet. Although when we talk about spent fuel, the idea was there quite for a long time, not with this name. As I said, the concept of circularity has not yet been captured, but we are working on, the standards, not in the IAEA publication, because the standards are essentially applied to safety aspects, right? Modern concepts, practical approaches as much as possible, based on real cases, are needed and must be shared. So this is one of the most important activities and duties of the agency, is to share the so-called good practices so that this can become known to everybody. Changing paradigms are needed. This is an important thing. We talk about, I think that many of you saw the opening of the Olympics, and without going into any analysis of the messages in the opening, we could see that one of the messages that were sent out by the organizers of the opening was diversity, was inclusion, was tolerance. These messages were there. I know there are many criticisms going on right now, but I believe that the message of diversity and inclusion were very strong messages. This is a changing paradigm, right, that is needed in the reality of the world we live today. And the changes in paradigms are also needed in the conversation we are having here. And these changes will tell us that waste should be seen as residues, not as waste, that can be put in beneficial use. In that regard, innovation will be needed along with funding schemes, stakeholder education, and so on and so forth. Regulations that have been established for a linear economy will also need to be adapted to a circular economy, not only in the side of the consumption, but also in terms of regulatory issues. And I give it to you that regulators tend to be very conservative because they will always claim the precautionary principle. If you don't understand, we should not do it. And then we might believe that being very restrictive, sometimes more than necessary, is the right solution. Circularity is not only to be considered to embrace materials, but also sites, as I demonstrated here. And of course, the IAEA is committed to support and work with its member states in this transition. And this course is a very concrete response to this movement. 4 years ago, we didn't plan to have such topic in this project, but it became clear that it was the right time to start to introduce this thinking. I can tell that we had a meeting in the agency some months ago, and still some people were asking, what do you mean by sustainable decommissioning? What is that? Some experts were asking us to give that particular answer. And in the case of remediation, because of the presentation that I've made, it became clearer. So there is a room for educating, for showing those things, not only for technical people like us, but decision makers and policy makers, because they will be needed in this process. So raising awareness is of ultimate importance. For that, we have a project that we are running. I think that Katrina will speak about another one that we are also running, but this one is applied to, particularly to NORM, and you are mostly welcome to participate. There will be a technical meeting in September, so the information sheet has been released, and it will be virtual, so that facilitates the participation of everybody. And this project deals with 6 important steps in what we call the holistic approach to norm management. First of all, we start with policies and strategies. So we have a document that lays down suggestions of items that could be adopted at the policy level by the member states to facilitate the holistic approach of norm residues. The second one is, and this is done in working groups, the second one deals about inventories. If you have a problem, you need to know how big is the problem, right? So if you have a material that you want to put into beneficial use, you need to tell the market how much do you have for a very analysis of the feasibility. Because imagine that you have a good thing to put forward, but it will not supply the need of the market because your amount is very limited. So you need to understand what are the inventories. We take note that still not everything can be recycled or can be reused or can be transformed. Some things need to be disposed as waste. But to make decisions about what is the best disposal option, we need to understand what are the associated costs. And the costs will vary from country to country. Katrina spoke about the Netherlands. Of course, the Netherlands have a very specific situation. They don't have room, they don't have space to, how can I say? They don't have space to sacrifice, to make disposal facilities for large amounts of waste. So they need to be smart in terms of recycling those wastes. For example, to use in dikes, because it's not by chance they are called the Netherlands, because they are below the sea level. So this is an application. The number 4 is characterization and sampling of materials. Believe me or not, this is a key problem in the international community, because you need to have some sort of consensus in providing results for different stakeholders. How did you sample this? How can I take that the sample is representative? So we need to agree upon some issues in terms of sampling and characterization. And we are providing guidance on how to do this. And the other one is another group with circular economy, where we are developing a framework to be considered in the valorization of norm residues in the scope of circular economy, discussing things like market analysis, social acceptance of these residues, the technologies. All this go into the publication. And finally, the commissioning of the facilities, because facilities will have a life cycle, and the end of the life cycle will be the commissioning. But we don't want to see the commissioning as the end of the life cycle, because we can repurpose the site, we can make use of the materials that are generated in the commissioning, and we are focusing essentially in the beginning in the oil and gas industry. So all these working groups are producing guidance material that we make available. This one is already prepared, it's just waiting for it to be published. And I expect that with the support of these experts in these different working groups, that we will have concluded this reports, these publications, by the end of this 2024. And will be made available as soon as possible. And again, in the last week of September, we're going to have a technical meeting where we will be discussing these things and more. And in this moment, we have the network on environmental remediation and management, the EnviroNet, of which Giuseppe and Catrinel are members of the steering committee. And this is a very good thing, because we are working together in different fronts, and we are constantly discussing. So we are updating each other and developing projects that led, for example, to this training course. And you are mostly welcome to join the EnviroNet. Just type EnviroNet IAEA, and then you will be sent to this homepage that doesn't look like this anymore. And then if you're not a member, you just click here and you get the instructions on how to become a member, and then you will be informed about our activities. But if you don't want to do that, okay, we still have an account in LinkedIn. You type in LinkedIn EnviroNet, and you can join, because you will get also the same type of information. And with that, I finish my presentation. Well, we still have a good time for lunch. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than glad to address. And even if you say, well, I don't agree with this, I don't agree with that, I would be very happy to hear from you. Thank you.